Hello and welcome back to On the Workbench. Today we're taking a look at Sears. It's sad to have to do this, but it looks like the end has finally come for one of my beloved childhood retailers and even into adulthood. I mean, I've bought my clothes, I've bought plenty of things from Sears, tools obviously, many of which you've seen some recent ones on this channel. I've still got a few more that I've got in my garage to be able to put up here on this channel that you'll probably still see in the coming weeks and months ahead. So what happened to Sears? Just a quick disclaimer, this contains news and editorial opinions. They are mine and mine alone. I've done my best to fact check them. This is not considered to be investment advice. If you need the advice on investments or anything else, you need to contact an investment professional. Please use your own jurisprudence on conducting and generating your own investment. You can lose sizable amounts of money if you make stupid moves in the stock market. So right now we're looking at the most recently released was from Q2 of 2018 financials released not that long ago. Sears had, and by Sears I really mean the combination of Sears and Kmart that comprise Sears Holding Company, had $3.1 billion in sales. However, after subtracting off everything, they actually ended up losing $508 million, but yet they still had $193 million in cash on hand and quickly burning through that. If you look at this over time, they've actually lost money for about 22 of the last 25 quarters, and that's your earnings before interest and taxes. And so it's hard to be able to sustain a business when you've lost money for 22 out of 25 quarters. That's just almost difficult to survive. I mean, how many of your households or your other businesses that you might work at could sustain that long? You know, Sears has a long history and a long balance sheet, and it's had a lot of just long bits of trust that folks have endured with Sears because of it being an enduring brand, thinking that it'll kind of last forever. But sadly, I don't think that's the case today. So what does that look like? Here's a quick graph here. That red line shows the $0 amount. And if you look at just how many quarters have been below zero since January 1st of 2011, which is what's on the far left, and just that continual bleeding of cash makes it hard to be able to be profitable, to be able to pay all of your merchants, and be able to pay for all your merchandise, pay for your labor, pay for your rent, pay for your real estate, cover all the necessary expenses, and be able to turn a profit. At the end of the day, Sears is a business, and the goal of most businesses is to be profitable. And so if you're losing money consecutively, you're just not going to be profitable, and that's just the reality of things. So the stock price back in 2007 had a pretty recent high, about $133.03 per share. As of October 11th, we saw that drop down to about 34 cents a share. In other words, about 99.74% of the market capitalization has been removed from Sears for a variety of reasons, and I think we'll be able to get to the crux of the problem of Sears here in just a moment. So if you look at the store count as of May 5th of 2010, it has been reported that about 356 Kmarts remain, about 506 active or your traditional mall-type Sears remain in existence across the country for a total of 862 stores. Whereas in about 2003, the combination of Sears and Kmart was somewhere around 2,300. So there's been about a 62% decline in stores. So obviously as the stores go down in count, you'd expect there to be a decline in revenue. Obviously, some of those stores who have been losing money or might have been seen as loss leaders in certain markets to keep other retailers out from being able to gain a foothold over Sears or Kmart. But as part of the reorganization of trying to get the books corrected, Sears has been closing stores at quite a rapid pace, especially in about the last 2 years. In 17 and 18, we've seen quite a few stores close. As those stores close, it's harder to bring in more revenue, as well as just inspire consumer confidence. If all of a sudden your stores are closing, you're not apt to go out and buy a Sears gift card for your friend. I used to buy a Sears gift card every year for my uncle and mail off because I knew he could always find something at Sears. But, you know, the last couple of years I've not done that because I can't guarantee that his Sears is still going to be around. So I've got to send him something else besides a Sears gift card. You know, all those store closings hurt consumer confidence, hurts the willingness of a consumer to go out and spend money and invest their hard-earned cash in Sears, not knowing if it's going to be there. Will they stand behind the warranties on their products? We don't know. Luckily with Craftsman, Stanley Black & Decker seems like they're stepping up to the plate and appear so far that they're going to be at least engaged in that lifetime warranty on Craftsman products. Can't say for much of the rest of the Sears line, but that's just kind of where it stands right now. So at the heart of this whole matter is a gentleman by the name of Eddie Lampert. He's currently the CEO of Sears, and he's been that since 2013, but he's been on the board for quite a while. He's also previously served as chairman, notably among tool enthusiasts, which is who probably most of you might be if you're watching this video. He was actually a board member of AutoZone and helped turn AutoZone around, and you can find AutoZone is doing quite well these days. Now, what I think is important here to point out before we go too much farther, he also has a strong controlling interest in ESL, or that's Eddie S. Lampert, conveniently enough, Investments, Inc., which is a private hedge fund that he controls. And then he also has a controlling interest in the real estate investment trust known as Seritage Growth Properties, which was originally a spin-off from Sears that he also has a controlling interest in. Now, Seritage is a publicly traded company as well, in addition to Sears Holdings. ESL is not publicly traded. It's a private hedge fund, and so that gets at one of the challenges that we're going to see when you've got two publicly traded companies under your belt that have overlapping interests. And with any publicly traded company, it's the job of the CEO to be able to grow shareholder value in those companies. And how do you do that when there's strong competing interests between those companies? So let's look at the cycle of death. This is as best as I can put together. I'm sure there's some flaws in this. If there are some flaws, please put it in the comments below. I would love to see your thoughts on this. Pause the video if you will here. But let's start with the blue circles. This is the Sears side. That when Sears created the Seritage, or real estate investment trust company known as Seritage, Sears effectively sold off a number of their properties to Seritage and then paid rent to Seritage. So in other words, the left hand was paying the right hand for rent on the properties that they were already in. Most folks, this went under the radar because their same local Sears or their local Kmart still stayed in the same building. It didn't appear like anything changed. Largely a strategic move on paper behind the scenes. But then as Sears lost money, Sears would close stores as part of stores closing or Kmart stores closing. Some of those stores got turned over to Seritage. Now we're moving over to the red side, where then Seritage would then take those properties, redevelop them, and in most cases redevelop them to something more profitable than a Sears or a Kmart. I've seen several examples where they've taken a Kmart property and broken that up into several outlots where they might have built a outlot restaurant on the property, split up the retail space, completely reconfigured that real estate. That since Kmart is has a long history as a legacy retailer, and Sears as well, there's some prime real estate assets among what was once all entirely Sears Holdings Company's assets. And so Seritage has been trying to leverage some of those strategically located real estate assets to be able to put more profitable businesses than what the Sears or the Kmart was on those assets before, whereby that Seritage as a publicly traded company can increase their shareholder value by effectively replacing one lower paying tenant with multiple higher paying tenants that generate more revenue. Now, some folks might say that that's, if you think a little bit about that Kelo versus Connecticut Supreme Court case about how do you generate more taxes back to the community. This isn't exactly Kelo versus Connecticut, but those of you that are familiar with that may be able to smell a whiff of that here, that there is some benefit to your community for doing this, possibly. Possibly. I'm not saying that's necessarily true. But as this cycle kind of spins on, that it's easy to see how Seritage would have a desire to acquire more Sears properties and are in a prime position to do that. That if Sears can't pay rent on the properties that are owned by Seritage, they just basically vacate their lease, because that's what it is. They're in a lease arrangement where they're basically leasing back the stores from what was themselves in the first place. and then Seritage can completely flip them into other properties and possibly make more money on the other end of things. And so you can see there's definitely a conflict of interest here among what's good for Sears is not necessarily what's good for Seritage, and what's good for Seritage is not necessarily good for Sears, but the same person has a strong controlling interest in both of these two companies that are at odds with each other here. And this is where I just find this to be a very dubious arrangement. And if you think I've mischaracterized this, please put this in the comments below if you think I'm wrong on this. But this is as best I can figure out here. And I think this is just almost criminal, if I can say that, for the way that this is set up. I don't think it actually is criminal, but it just feels dirty. Moving on, the other issue here, Eddie Lampert also owns ESL, which is his private hedge fund. And so that hedge fund has also been loaning money to Sears over time. That is, Sears has lost money. They've been borrowing money, or ESL's been lending them money, whatever way you want to look at it, to Sears. And then Sears, because they've borrowed that money, then has to pay ESL back principal and interest, just like you would any other loan. And so ESL gets to collect on the interest off of that money. As Sears pays more and more interest off, it's harder to become profitable. And so that can lead to selling off assets. We saw them sell off Craftsman a while back to Stanley Black & Decker. There's been attempts recently to be able to sell off the Kenmore brand that have been unsuccessful so far, as well as the Home Services brand, or the Home Services unit. And ESL has been trying to buy those. I'm not convinced it's been at market value. But, they've been trying to acquire those assets. And so as we turn the crank here, with ESL's strategic injection of capital into Sears, you've got the CEO's private hedge fund throwing money at Sears, which in turn is using money from the Sears stores to be put back into the hedge fund, which then reinvests it and then can siphon off all that interest to be able to grow the hedge fund larger and larger. It's a private hedge fund, so its rules are different than publicly traded companies. But ultimately, this sets up ESL to also be a creditor of Sears, in addition to Seritage, so that when Sears has no money left and all the money has been sucked out of the company, well, ESL is in line with Seritage to be able to collect the assets, if it comes to bankruptcy. And so this is what I think it comes to. People want money, people want power. It's hard for me to see this any other way. If you can see this differently, please put your thoughtful comments below. It's just hard for me to see that this had to end up in the way that we've ended up today in 2018. And the fact that we might not see Sears at all in 2019 or beyond really brings a tear to my eye, and I think it's sad for the state of the corporate reality that we're in and what's been done to it. And in many cases been done right in front of our very eyes. And some of the associates I've talked with and just tried to talk with very casually about this, it's hard to engage an employee with some detailed financial information like this. But it seems like they're either don't want to talk about it, which would be reasonable, or they're just completely clueless to what's going on behind the scenes. Because how many folks want to read prospectuses, want to read CEO notes and other corporate balance sheet information that is considered public information from the Securities and Exchange Commission? As you dig into the company, there's been lots of predictions for the last 7 or 8 years that there's just been this death spiral on Sears, and they've been on death alert. And it's hard for me to say that's anything but greed, and that's just what I think it comes down to, is greed, 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 and a desire for money. I think about the Toys R Us bankruptcy recently, and how that was largely due to a leveraged buyout, and how much money was spent there, despite Toys R Us, to my understanding, still being profitable. It just wasn't profitable enough to cover the amount of money that was spent on the leveraged buyout, and as a result of that, that took out a number of jobs across the country, placed holes in a number of shopping centers, and saw the death of that brand, which I think could have been saved Had it not been for some elements of corporate greed to completely kill off a company, run it into the ground, to try to extract the assets from it, just over some greed. Now, obviously, the investors in Toys R Us thought they could get more money for it. Even though it was profitable, it just wasn't profitable enough to be able to cover the debt service that was created. When had it not went through the leveraged buyout, I think we would still see Toys R Us today. And so I think there's some of this dirty business to what goes on behind the scenes. I'm not sure what can be done about it exactly, other than just being aware of it. And I would hope that board members and shareholders can respond appropriately when elements like this come out, that opinions are known, and that in the financial media we can talk about this, because I think this is an important issue. If you go back to 2006, when Eddie Lampert he wasn't the CEO, he was the chairman, and he had a letter, and I've just got one paragraph here on the screen, just a couple little highlights here from it. Success must include profitable growth. As a team, we are aligned around the goal of increasing our EBITDA. We are not focused on sales or sales growth as an end in itself, nor will we spend capital on stores simply because we have the capital available to invest because everyone else does it. Rather, we are investing in our stores where the investment makes sense, or in other words, where it improves the experience of our customers and our associates and leads to attractive returns. Our culture around capital is intense, and it is not simply about not spending. It's about investing well. Our philosophy is that we should not spend a dollar too little, or a dollar too much, or 50,000 too little. We are constantly evaluating how best to use the considerable capital that Sears Holdings has on its balance sheet and the cash flow we expect to generate every year. We continually work to use our resources to fuel improved profitability, unquote. So I thought it's interesting in this quote here. Eddie Lampert's very careful not to say in this letter that it's about using the resources to fuel improved profitability of Sears. I mean, I guess that's kind of implied, about using their capital and their resources wisely. It's hard not to look at this letter, in hindsight in 2018 and go, well, wait a minute. Back then, maybe he had a plan for how he could be extracting value from the company, and you don't want to be throwing out too much cash. If there's a chance, you could get a piece of that cash yourself, pull it off to the side into your own little private slush fund. So does the company really need this? Or do you think you can kind of let this slide and eventually siphon that money off onto your own slush fund? Again, just my own opinion on it, but I think there were some warning signs back in 2006 from Eddie's letter. That is actually, it's a publicly available letter on the Sears Holding corporate website. I got their link below here on the screen. So October 15th, so that's where we're at today, and that's our Doomsday Clock. So Sears has a debt service payment due coming on Monday of about $134 million, and in total they owe about $5 billion. Now the problem is the amount of cash on hand. I can't find an exact amount what it is. Theoretically, at the end of the second quarter, they would have had the $134 million in cash, but from the amount of money they're losing quarter over quarter, it's easy to see how that they would not have the $134 million. And Eddie Lampert's been clear recently that he does not intend on loaning the company any more money. And with owing $5 billion, the creditors, incidentally, also Eddie Lampert, so he's the CEO of Sears and also happens to be leading two other creditors. So either way, he stands to lose or gain at the same time through this, through what I think is a significant conflict of interest. On the side, there's the pension fund that Sears has about 100,000 retirees or pensioners. The fund is about 62% funded. Notable, this apparently from the reports in the Chicago, or the Crane's Chicago Small Business Journal, was that this is the second lowest among the 100 largest pension funds that it was tracking. There is a federal government agency known as the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation that is in place to potentially bail this out with taxpayer money. So it's kind of sad to see that the CEO might not be forced to have to pay the extra money on this to be able to bail out the pensioners and the retirees who retired in good faith, thinking that they had the weight of a strong, legendary retailer behind their retirement fund, only to see it possibly vanish. And I don't think that we as taxpayers should be on the hook for this. I think the other bits of creditors, in this case when there's that conflict of interest, should be on the hook to have to pay that other 48% of the pension fund to get that fully funded so that Sears could actually meet its obligations to its retirees, which I think it's sad that it wouldn't be able to do that, the folks that have banked on that being there for their golden years. So with the October 15th deadline looming, the options are very limited for what Sears can do if they can't come up with the money. Like I said, the CEO, Eddie Lampert, appears that he's not interested in loaning Sears any additional funds. In other words, his left hand doesn't want to feed money to his right hand, and he may be thinking that this is the right time to pull the plug and to try to take what's left, because as a creditor, both in terms of as ESL and as Seritage, both of them stand to stake a strong claim to much of what remains of Sears. You know, between their good name, the brands, the assets, and the real estate to be able to help cover that debt. Yeah, there's also the merchants out there. I'm not sure what the breakdown is of debt owed to whom and to how much. You know, which, you know, to be fair, does open the possibility that if you could get rid of some of the legacy assets, in particular the pension obligations, and restructure that and create a new Sears, I'll call it a Sears 2.0, that may not have a pension fund. You could structure it more like an Amazon corporation. You could use 401ks. You could completely retinker with the business model by getting rid of legacy assets. You know, make it a potential that they could do that. I'm not saying they will, and that potentially, you know, could be useful. But, you know, it's certainly a challenge for legacy retailers to compete against newer startups. You know, you look in the retail space where Sears is on the clothing side. One of the ones that catches my attention is Kohl's. I think they've done quite well lately. You also got other groups like Walmart and Target. Neither of those have the long history that Sears had, and what was once considered just a normal part of the social contract, if you will, of doing business, just isn't there anymore, particularly around pensions. If you go digging around, Lampert's got a few quotes about not being a big fan of the pension obligations. And so ultimately this leads us into a couple options here. Sears can either go for a Chapter 7 or a Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Technically there's a Chapter 13 bankruptcy option possible, but I don't think that would necessarily work. Correct me if I'm wrong down below. But the biggest issue here is that Chapter 7 would lead to basically, and it may not be exactly the court, but it could be a court-appointed arbiter to manage the distribution of assets, to repay the debts, which, in all fairness, may or may not work to Eddie Lampert's satisfaction of his other hand, which is why I'm inclined to think they're going to try to ask for a Chapter 11 to allow the company to restructure so that maybe there's a little bit more assets that can be sucked out of Sears, particularly over the coming holiday season, and then see it go out of business. In all fairness, we have seen other companies recover from bankruptcy. We've seen General Motors, we've seen American Airlines, United Airlines, a number of companies that have went into bankruptcy and come out. So it doesn't have to be a tailspin. But given what I've showed you up there before, it's hard for me not to think that, you know, that Eddie might be thinking there's just a little bit more juice to be had to be sucked out of Sears through the bankruptcy process, and then it's legally all his in his other hand. And he successfully has transferred a publicly traded company into his private hedge fund and into another company that he controls. And that's kind of sad. You know, leaving how many folks in the lurch in the process, completely changing the American retail landscape Obviously I think of Jeff Bezos at Amazon's probably just looking on with a big old grin on his face going, this can't happen soon enough. So with that, that's just my thoughts here on this. If you got any other comments, please put it below. And I look forward to hopefully a thoughtful discussion below. And if you're sad like me, whatever, feel free to give us a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Love to see your feedback below on this. Have a great day and have a great weekend. Bye.